Hello YouTubers, and welcome back to Be a Loser. The last video in this series discussed why snacking makes you fat, and we learned a bit about how persistently high levels of insulin can lead to insulin resistance, and in turn this leads to weight gain and obesity. So continuing this line of discussion, we should take a closer look at insulin resistance itself, why it happens, what causes it, and how it leads to weight gain, obesity, and T2D. It's worth noting that most of my other series touch on different aspects of this, especially the T2D and LCHF series, so they're probably worth watching as well. But for this video, let's really find out how we become insulin resistant. And to understand that, we're going to have to understand insulin, how it works, as well as resistance and tolerance. So if you watch my other series, we've covered many aspects of insulin and its purpose in the body. But let's review a bit and maybe even expand upon our previous understanding. All foods to some degree stimulate the production of insulin, but not all stimulate this equally. Carbohydrates, especially those that are highly refined and processed, stimulate insulin production greatly. But protein also stimulates insulin, if to a lesser degree. And of course, dietary fats stimulate insulin the least. But why is insulin produced in the first place? Well, as we eat, not all of the food energy is used immediately, and so blood glucose levels begin to rise. So our body secretes insulin to redirect this flow of glucose into storages within the body. One of these storages is as glycogen in the liver. This is a very easy process and can work just as easily in reverse. Glucose to glycogen, back to glucose, and so on. The issue here is that there's limited space in the liver for glycogen storage, so the remaining dietary carbohydrates are stored in the fat cells. Now there are different areas where this fat is located. Two of these are subcutaneous, meaning under the skin, and visceral, meaning around the organs. Obviously the latter, visceral fat, that's dangerous and of great concern. This fat is typically carried around the waist and often called a spare tire. Now, fat storage is virtually unlimited, but much more difficult to access. This creates our two-compartment problem. Glucose or glycogen in one compartment, which is easily accessed, and fat in another compartment, which is not easily accessed. And unfortunately, our body can only access one at a time. So as we can see, insulin is one of the main hormones promoting fat storage. And this process is absolutely situation normal. We eat, insulin levels go up, some energy goes to the liver as glycogen, and the rest is stored as fat. The fat actually has three possible uses. It can be used directly for energy, but because the body is secreting insulin, this signals that we have plenty of energy from our ingested carbohydrates or glucose. So the second option is for the liver to move the fat, either inside other organs such as the pancreas, around other organs viscerally, or under the skin subcutaneously. And the final option is to store the fat inside the liver. So once we finish eating, our blood sugar levels begin to drop, and thus so do our insulin levels. Several hours later, as we begin to enter a fasted state, our body signals the liver to release the stored glycogen in order to fuel our brain, muscles, and organs. This process is known as glycogenolysis and generally occurs overnight if you haven't eaten. So now that we're not eating, the fat storage begins to occur in reverse. This once again, situation normal. The liver releases the glycogen as glucose for energy, and if there isn't enough stored sugar, then the body releases energy from our stored fat. That's the natural process of our bodies. We eat, we store sugar and fat. We don't eat, we burn sugar and fat. But that second part can only occur in the absence of insulin. So if we always have high insulin levels, then our body of course responds as though we're eating. It stores sugar and fat. So if our eating and fasting periods are not balanced, then this will lead to weight gain and eventually obesity. But just eating alone doesn't lead to sustained high levels of insulin. If you only eat 3 meals per day, say 7 a.m., 12 p.m., and 7 p.m., then your eating period is offset by an equal fasting period with time in between each meal for insulin levels to drop. But as we saw in the previous video, if we now add in snacks and eat 5 or 6 times a day, then we're creating imbalance in our eating and fasting periods and constantly stimulating insulin. And this is what leads us to insulin resistance. We know that insulin drives weight gain, and to a lesser degree, we know what drives increases in insulin. But as we've already seen, timing is important as well. But not just the timing of our meals. Think about someone you know who has not been overweight or obese for very long, and when they finally decide to lose the weight, they're able to do so pretty easily. I know. They're just lucky, or they're one of the blessed few, right? Well, okay, so then there are those people who have been overweight or obese for most, if not all, of their lives. These individuals have a very, and I mean very, hard time losing weight. So why would that be? I mean, if all you have to do is reduce calories eaten, as under the Eat Less, Move More calorie restriction weight loss model, then it shouldn't make any difference if you've been overweight for a week or 10 years. Now, I know that model is crap, as we've seen in other videos. But let's also look at LCHF. If all you have to do is lower the carbs you eat, then it shouldn't matter how long you've been obese. But as we know, that's not really the case here either. And if we look back even further in someone's life, we can see that obese children tend to be obese adults, and children of obese parents tend to be obese themselves. So what the heck is going on? Well, the missing part in both the previous examples is insulin resistance. It's the time-dependent factor of obesity. Insulin acts on insulin receptors to bring glucose into cells. Initially, doctors thought of the relationship as a lock and key model. The receptor is like a lock, and insulin is the key that opens that lock. They believed that when we're insulin resistant, the insulin, the key, doesn't work as well and can't unlock the lock, the insulin receptor, quite as well, and the door remains shut. The cell would realize that it's not receiving enough glucose and stimulate the body to secrete more insulin. The insulin doesn't work any better to unlock the receptor, but because we now have so much more of it, so many more keys, the cell would be able to open and get the glucose that it needs. But researchers had to determine where the problem was occurring. Was it an issue with the insulin itself or with the insulin receptor? Well, if one looks closely at the structure of insulin, it isn't really any different between an obese individual and a non-obese individual. The chains that build the hormone are the same. Insulin is insulin. However, when they looked at the structure of the insulin receptor, well, it wasn't impaired either. So what's causing the insulin resistance? Well, if you look at resistance outside the body, it can shed some light on this. One such resistance is one I'm sure you've heard of before. Antibiotic resistance. We all live in fear of that antibiotic-resistant bacteria that will end the world as we know it. So how do these organisms become resistant to antibiotics? Well, when we use the level of antibiotics, there are a few bacteria that are naturally immune. They reproduce and create a whole new generation that is now resistant to this level of antibiotics. So we use more antibiotics and a few bacteria survive, reproduce, and are then treated with even more antibiotics and so on. So we have a bit of a catch-22 here. Antibiotics cause antibiotic resistance. So the answer is to reduce the amount and use of antibiotics. Another example would be drug tolerance. When one takes a drug, especially an illicit drug, there's typically a very strong initial reaction. But the next time that drug is taken, the response is slightly less, and each time thereafter, the response diminishes. While this is called tolerance, it's in fact the body becoming resistant to the drug. And to overcome this resistance, one must use higher and higher amounts or dosages of drugs. So this means that drugs cause drug resistance or tolerance. Now, while these aren't quite the same as insulin resistance, they do pose an interesting premise. The natural response to overcome antibiotic resistance is to use more antibiotics. The natural response to overcome drug resistance is to use more drugs. So the natural response to overcome insulin resistance is to create more insulin. But as you use more and more of something, be it antibiotics or insulin, you create more resistance until eventually there is no amount left that you can add to make a difference. As you use more of something against resistance, then what you're using becomes less and less effective. This fact is actually used in the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. This disease is characterized by children being hyperactive. They're treated with a drug called Ritalin. Now, if the children are hyperactive, then one would assume that Ritalin is a depressant, but surprise, surprise, it's actually a stimulant.
What the hell are you talking about?
I know, right? So how the heck does that work? Well, as in our previous examples, high levels of stimulant create resistance to stimulants. It follows the same pattern. Stimulants cause stimulant resistance. So returning to insulin resistance, can we now assume that insulin causes insulin resistance? Well, if the insulin isn't impaired and the receptor isn't impaired, then what's happening? Well, we must first look closer at the liver. Insulin has two main effects on the liver. First, when you eat, insulin tells the liver to stop the process of creating new glucose, which we know as gluconeogenesis. The second major effect of insulin on the liver is to increase the production of fat, a process known as de novo lipogenesis, or DNL. Now, when we have insulin resistance in the liver, or hepatic insulin resistance, we would expect both of these effects to be impaired. The liver should stop making glucose and stop making fat. But what's actually observed is while the liver does continue creating glucose, it also increases fat production. This means that the cells in the liver are both resistant to insulin and hypersensitive to it. How can that be? Well, the lock and key model is clearly wrong. So doctors started thinking of IR as an overflow model. All that we know for sure is that an insulin-resistant cell is difficult to get glucose into. With the overflow model, this means that the cell is already completely full of glucose and no more can be put in. This makes it appear as though the cell is resistant to insulin. But in reality, the problem is simply that the cell is too full of glucose. So the natural response is to create more insulin to push the glucose into the cell. But this only works for a short time. The reason that the DNL, or fat production, was increased was not in reality due to the cells being more sensitive to insulin. This was caused because the cells are trying to get rid of all the excess glucose by turning it into fat. So now that we have a better framework for what's happening when we're insulin resistant, we must then return to the question, is insulin causing insulin resistance? Well, let's look for a bit more proof. There's a rare tumor of the pancreas known as insulinoma. Normally, the pancreas makes more insulin when your blood sugar is high and less when those levels drop. But when you have an insulinoma, the tumor will keep making insulin even when your blood sugar gets too low. So if insulin causes insulin resistance, then in these individuals, we would expect to see high IR. And studies have shown that that is exactly what happens. As a response to the increasing insulin levels, the body must become resistant, or the result would be severe hypoglycemia and death. This is why insulin resistance is actually protective, even though it leads to weight gain and obesity. And when this insulinoma is surgically removed, the insulin resistance disappears. Pretty convincing of the argument that insulin causes IR. But to make it definitive, researchers endeavored to give subjects insulin resistance. They gave one group insulin injections in increasing dosages, and their blood glucose was kept stable. By the end of the study, the insulin group had developed 15% greater insulin resistance than the control group. And in another study, researchers took healthy, non-obese, non-pre-diabetic, non-diabetic subjects and gave them constant infusions of insulin for 96 hours. And at the end of that 96 hours, their insulin sensitivity had dropped by 20 to 40%. That's fairly disturbing. Since IR is diagnostic of T2D, this means that within 4 days, one can be well on the way to being obese and diabetic. As we've seen from my T2D series, in trying to control blood glucose with insulin, doctors have worsened their patients' diabetes. This too was shown in a study. It wasn't the intent of the study, but in giving 100 units of insulin per day, the researchers actually worsened the subject's diabetes. And as is postulated, the increased IR resulted in weight gain as well. In fact, 19 pounds, 8.7 kilograms, in only 6 months. And all that while they were eating 300 fewer calories than when they started the study. So insulin does indeed cause insulin resistance. This IR then causes the body to create more insulin. So now instead of what we're eating driving the insulin production, it's the insulin resistance that drives it. And with the IR increasing insulin levels, those levels increase weight gain. So those who are fat continue to get fat, but not solely based on their diet. Instead, it's mostly because of their insulin resistance. And this is the time-dependent factor that all the diets miss. Those who haven't been overweight for very long haven't had time to develop significant insulin resistance. So a dietary intervention, changing what they eat, has a much greater effect on their weight. The diet is the main driver of insulin levels. But those who've struggled with obesity for a significant amount of time have a much harder road because making dietary changes has largely no effect on the main driver of their insulin levels, the insulin resistance. And it's hardest for obese children because they've dealt with IR their entire lives, literally. Children born to obese mothers have lived in high insulin levels since conception. They'll have an incredibly difficult time controlling their weight and most likely grow into obese adults. I don't think we really need studies to prove this, but they're out there, and of course in the description of this video. The longer you're obese, the more difficult it is to not be obese. And because type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin resistance, then it follows that insulin causes T2D. So the answer then should be obvious, right? To reverse T2D, to reverse obesity, we must reverse insulin resistance. To do that, we must lower, not raise, insulin levels. But one might ask the question, well, if just giving someone injections of insulin can cause IR, then why aren't we all afflicted with it? And the answer is because of the way in which insulin is secreted. All hormones, and I mean all with a capital A, are released in a pulsatile fashion. I did discuss that in my circadian rhythm video. The hormones aren't released in large amounts all the time. No, instead they're released in high amounts some of the time and in minuscule amounts or not at all at other times. And there's a great purpose in this. This is the body's natural way of preventing, let's say it together, resistance. Our bodies are highly adaptable. So whenever we're exposed to a constant stimulus, the body will become acclimated to it. You probably experience it every night and don't even think about it. You're getting ready for bed in the bathroom with the light on. Then you walk into the bedroom where it's dark. And for a few moments, you can't see. But then your eyes adapt and you can see quite well. When we go from the lighted bathroom to the dark bedroom, we develop resistance to dark. And the opposite is true. But if we're in the bathroom and adapted to the light and turn the lights off for a brief moment, we don't lose our adaptation to the light. It's confusing, but hormones work the same way. Generally speaking, hormone levels are very low, but occasionally they're briefly raised to high levels and then fall low again. This rapid increase and decrease keeps the body from adapting to the hormone. In essence, it's like being in a dark room all the time and occasionally turning on the lights for a moment. The moment of blinding light is like the pulse of hormones. The body never allows us to become adapted to the light, the hormone, and thus it always maintains its full effect. So what does this mean for us? Well, the pulsatile nature of insulin release prevents the development of insulin resistance. But when we receive constant exposure to insulin, this changes everything. In the previous experiment, the subjects were given constant infusions of insulin, and this led to insulin resistance. But high insulin levels alone don't lead to insulin resistance. Instead, there are two requirements for this: high insulin levels and constant stimulus. So if we alter what we eat to say lots and lots of refined carbohydrates, this alone is not enough to cause resistance. While the diet will cause very high levels of insulin release, these levels aren't persistent. We're not under constant stimulus of insulin. This is why if we examine the 1950s, there was little obesity, even though they were eating white bread and drinking soda with sugar and eating cookies and Rice Krispies. And this was because of their eating pattern. They ate 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, between about 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. In between those meals, they didn't eat snacks. So this means that from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m., they were fasting. 10 hours of feeding with 14 hours of fasting every day. And because they weren't eating in between their meals, their insulin was able to drop to normal levels. Because of this, insulin resistance could not develop. But when you add in snacks between each meal and before bedtime, you now meet both requirements for resistance, high levels and persistent levels. Now, insulin doesn't affect all areas of the body the same. Each part of your body has a different sensitivity to insulin and thus a different resistance to it. They're separate and don't affect one another. For example, exercise increases the sensitivity of the muscles to insulin, but has no effect on the brain or the liver. And conversely, hepatic insulin resistance has no effect on the brain or muscles. So when we eat excess carbohydrate, this has the effect of increasing the liver insulin resistance. This increases insulin levels overall, but has no effect on the brain's sensitivity to the insulin. So now you have receptors in the brain that have normal sensitivity being exposed to increased insulin. Since the brain controls hunger as well as energy expenditure, this has the effect of increasing your body set weight. And that is how we gain weight. Well, it took a while to get there, but hopefully that gives you all the information you ever wanted about what insulin resistance is, how we become insulin resistant, and how it causes us to gain weight, become obese, and ultimately diabetic. I want to encourage you all once again to visit Dr. Jason Fung's blog at Intensive Dietary Management, where I get the majority of my knowledge and information. And read these articles for yourselves. I summarize them here, but if you really want an immersive experience, then it really is the place to get it. There's a link to his site in the description of almost every video I post. Now, if this is your first time to the channel, I encourage you to subscribe and enable alerts by clicking the bell so that you know when new videos post. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter for updates, as well as our website. And if you liked this video or any of our videos, please consider clicking that like button and help us gain a little more exposure. You can also share this and any video with friends and family on any of your social media or email using the share link below the video. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching. And until next time, keep being a loser.